Well, thank you very much, Peter. Firstly, can I too acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Can I thank Julie and Alison and the other sponsors for their contributions to tonight, but particularly Melinda and Diane and the team at CEDA for hosting this evening, and to see so many distinguished public servants, people from the private sector, for the not-for-profit sector here to debate Australia's future. And I feel like I'm the warm-up act for myself here tonight, because I'm speaking at CEDA on Monday, releasing the intergenerational report, which will kick off a broader discussion too about our challenges we face, whether it's around productivity, population, the ageing of the population and the like. But it is a real pleasure to be here with you tonight. Earlier this year, I was hanging out with my family on a Sunday, as I like to do, watching Peppa Pig, Bluey, Bananas in Pyjamas, and my phone rang. And it was a man called Father Christor MacDonald, a priest in County Cork, Ireland, a dear friend of mine. And he rang me because he was in a bad way because of COVID. Not because he had contracted the virus himself, but because he was burying a member of his congregation each and every week from the virus. And it made me reflect on what was happening around the world as opposed to here in Australia. In that month that he rang me, 400,000 people lost their lives around the world because of COVID. Ireland, with less than a fifth of Australia's population of 5 million people, has had around 5,000 deaths. Australia has lost 35 people for every 1 million people across our population. In comparison, Canada's lost more than 500 people per million. In the United States, it's more than 1,500. In the United Kingdom, it's more than 1,800 people. Indeed, if Australia had seen the loss of life that was on average across the OECD, we would have lost more than 30,000 souls. We've lost 910 Australians through COVID. This year, not one death due to someone contracting the virus here in Australia. We have, as a nation, remarkably dodged a bullet on the health front, even though tonight our fellow Australians are facing some pretty tough restrictions as outbreaks are happening in New South Wales. So on the health front, we've been remarkably successful. But equally on the economic front, we've also dodged a bullet. Last year, the UK economy contracted by 9.9%. The French and the Italian economies contracted by around 8%. The Canadian and Japanese economies by around 5%. Yet the Australian economy contracted by 2.5%, well ahead of any advanced economy. Now, it wasn't always going to be thus. And I see some members of Treasury here in the audience. Treasury said to me last year, at the height of the crisis, that they feared that unemployment could reach as high as 15%, more than 2 million of our fellow Australians unemployed. They said the economy could contract by more than 20%. That would be nearly the equivalent of taking the state of Victoria out of the national economy. And they feared that the combination of this contraction in economic growth, as well as the rise in unemployment, would have a long-term scarring impact on the Australian economy. Now, as you know, we responded with what is now $291 billion of direct economic support, nearly 15% of GDP. Programs which historians will look back on, like JobKeeper and the cash flow boost, and the coronavirus supplement and the $750 payments to pensioners, veterans and carers, helped to build a bridge from one side of this crisis to the other side of this crisis. I've said it before, that before I announced the JobKeeper program with the Prime Minister, I rang John Howard, who I had the opportunity to work for previously. And I said to him what we were thinking of unveiling, an economy-wide wage subsidy at a flat $1,500 a fortnight, regardless of the amount of hours you had worked. And I said, as a Liberal Treasurer, I didn't expect to be announcing such a large scheme. And he said to me, at times of national crises, there are no ideological constraints. And that was very much the view we took as a government as we unveiled this unprecedented amount of economic support. Importantly, it wasn't just federal government support. It was very much a Team Australia moment. There were the states with their support, but there were also the banks who played a key role in providing relief from interest and principal payments on loans. There was the property sector that worked to provide rental relief. I visited a small business in Chapel Street in Melbourne not that long ago. It had 8 staff, it was a homewares business, it had a small cafe with it. And the lady told me that she had 8 staff going into COVID. She'd only moved into the premises 6 months before. She'd mortgaged a house, she pretty much put it all on the line. COVID hit, and she suddenly had to stand down her staff. JobKeeper was announced, and she brought it back on her staff. She was able to access the cash flow boost. She went to her bank, she got relief on her interest payments. She went to her landlord, she got relief on her rent. Now her business, which she feared would fall over, has now more staff than she had going into the crisis. That is just one vignette from a broader economy where the measures that we took and put in place have helped stem the tide of job losses and seen the economy rebound very strongly. So the net impact of all that economic support has seen an incredibly resilient labour market, with the unemployment rate down today to 5.1%, bearing in mind that when we came to government it was 5.7%. In the most recent numbers in May, we saw 115,000 new jobs, 85% of those being full-time jobs. There are now more women in work than ever before. And Australia, ahead of any advanced economy, has got more people in employment than ever before. The labour market has outperformed the RBA Treasury's most optimistic expectations. Equally, in terms of GDP growth, we saw in the March quarter 1.8%, beating market expectations. What was particularly pleasing for us is what is driving that recovery is what is happening in the private sector. We saw dwelling investment at its highest level in 17 years. We've seen machinery and equipment at its highest level in 18 years. We've seen a very strong winter harvest with farm GDP, farm output, at its highest level in 7 years. And the last 3 quarters of economic growth combined have seen the strongest levels of growth in more than 50 years. I dwell on these facts because we're not out of the pandemic, and we shouldn't gloss over the fact that Australia has outperformed the rest of the world. Our economy today is bigger than it was going into the pandemic. No advanced economy, not Japan, not Canada, not the United States, not England, the UK, not France, not Germany, can say that about the economic recovery. And so our recovery has been incredibly strong. Now, as we were putting together the budget, which is now just 6 weeks old, we knew that the economy was recovering strongly. That was the backdrop. The other half of the equation was that globally, there were 800,000 new COVID cases every day. In Europe, they've gone into a double-dip recession. In the United States, the latest package, which is at $1.9 trillion, has not seen the bump or the lift in employment like we have seen here in Australia. Today, employment in the United States is 5% below where it was going into the pandemic. Yet here in Australia, employment is above where it was going into the pandemic. And so we knew we had to keep our foot to the accelerator with respect to our economic plan. So the budget saw a continuation of what has worked well to this very point. In terms of tax, we extended, as you know, the low and middle income tax offset for another year. And that builds on the structural reforms that we've already legislated, like the abolition of a full tax bracket, the 37 cents in the dollar tax bracket, legislated as part of stage 3. We put in place an extension of the immediate expensing and the loss carry back provisions. You know, one of the challenges we have with respect to productivity in this country is that investment outside of the mining sector has not been as strong as we would have liked. And so capital deepening requires the government to put in place incentives like we did in the budget with immediate expensing. It's had a hugely important impact. Normally during recessions, you see a capital strike from businesses as they put their hands in their pocket and they become risk averse. This time round, we've seen a jump in investment as a result of the incentives that were put in place. We doubled down on our skills programs with the extension of our apprentice wage subsidy at 50%. $2.7 billion for 170,000 apprenticeships. A massive investment by the government, including also the extension of the job trainer program. On infrastructure, we've built a 10-year, $110 billion pipeline of infrastructure projects. Again, rolling those projects out, and some of that funding being on a use it or lose it basis, which is then getting a bit of competition between the states in order for them to spend the money that the Commonwealth has allocated. We had in this budget additional money for childcare as well, probably a topic that you will be discussing over coming days. We see the childcare investment, bearing in mind that the Commonwealth already spends more than $10 billion a year on childcare, very much as a workforce participation measure, with Treasury estimating that our childcare measures announced in the budget could add up to 300,000 additional work hours a week to the economy. And where our focus with respect to childcare is about ensuring that families with more than one child in childcare could get a rebate of up to 95%. And that will make it easier for families who want to work that 4th or 5th day to take that choice with this extra childcare support. A very important measure. So infrastructure, building workforce participation through childcare, the skills agenda, the immediate expensing for business investment and the support for families through tax cuts were all part of our measures in the budget to continue to do what we're doing, which is to support the economy right through this pandemic. Another big part of the budget was around what we call the essential services. An unprecedented amount of funding, for example, in aged care at $17.7 billion. But it's not just a financial commitment. If you unpack the aged care announcement, it's also about significant structural reform. Roles of the regulators, more audits, payment $10 extra per day for providers of residential care per person, respite services for carers, retention bonuses for nurses. There is quite significant reform across the aged care system, which is designed to ensure that we get a higher quality of service, we get more safety, obviously, in an area where clearly there had been significant failures as indicated by the Royal Commission. The NDIS saw an estimates variation of $13 billion in this budget. Over 100,000 additional people joined the NDIS in the last year alone. There are now 450,000 people on the NDIS. It's a bipartisan supported initiative It's a landmark social reform, and it is something that is making a difference to so many people and their families across the country. But it is going to be a challenging one, because we've seen the increased cost in the programs, and we've seen a rapid increase in the number of people on the program itself. And again, the intergenerational report will point out some of the additional costs that will be incurred over time. And we're absolutely committed to ensuring that that program is fully funded. Mental health, which you know is not just a health issue, it's also an economic issue, was a big focus in the budget. Over $2 billion of new measures in the budget. Tragically, suicide is the #1 cause of death in Australia for people aged 18 to 44. 65,000 Australians attempt to take their life each and every year. And what we've focused on in this budget is measures for people who enter into hospital as a result of a failed suicide attempt and then come out without the necessary support. And we're putting in place measures to do that, as well as a whole host of other programs, including boosting headspace, as well as for more older Australians as well, with a new set of centres called the Head to Health program. So this budget had an enormous amount in it in terms of mental health, aged care, the NDIS. There's a major women's safety package in this program as well. We've listed new drugs on the PBS, in addition to what were the direct economic measures which I've alluded to earlier. And I think just because a budget's 6 weeks old doesn't mean we stop talking about it. It's a massive injection of support into the community across a range of areas. To finish up, I do think that the economy will look different on the other side of COVID. I think COVID's going to be with us for some time to come. We're going to have to learn to live with the virus as we seek to mitigate its impacts and we seek to roll out the vaccine to as wide as a number of people as quickly as possible. The economy is going to look different in a number of ways. Firstly, we have seen a rapid adoption of technology during this crisis. And the technology is changing the way we work, the way we communicate, the way we shop. I visited Cotton On, Australia's largest global retailer, recently in Geelong. And they told me about the massive surge of online sales. And so what they're investing in, instead of bricks and mortar at retail, they're investing in bricks and mortar in terms of distribution centres. And we're seeing a major change in the way people shop. The way people communicate via Zoom now is going to replace, for a lot of people, to hop on a plane and travel interstate for a single board meeting or a single committee meeting. And I think that will change the way we communicate. The way we work also, having seen through this pandemic many people adapt to working from home as opposed to the office, I think will permanently change a lot of behaviours. McKinsey did a study where they found for professional services firms that 25% of people will now work probably permanently from home at least 2 days a week. That's going to have an impact on the CBDs. May also have an impact on productivity, but it's going to change the way people work, and it's probably a trend that will only grow with time. The fact that in this pandemic we've seen the uptake of technology, we'll also see, I think, a real benefit to our regions across the country. We're already seeing a lot of people move from city and suburban areas into our regions. Why? Because they're scared of this pandemic and the next one. And they want a lifestyle choice where they can get a bigger block of land, house and land package, for a fraction of the cost that they might be paying in the cities, and they can be digitally connected and work from the regions. So we've seen a real movement of people. And when I was speaking to Janet Yellen recently in the United States, she said she was seeing exactly the same phenomena in the United States. And then a third, I think, permanent change we will see across our economy and indeed the global economy is with respect to supply chains. Governments are not going to leave things to chance. We were incredibly versatile during this pandemic. You had gin distilleries in Tasmania making hand sanitizer. You had ResMed turning from sleep apnea devices to ventilators. You had a mask manufacturer in Shepparton that operated one shift a day, 5 days a week with one machine, suddenly put in place more machines, work a 24/7 shift and produce millions of masks for our country. We were able to adapt, but we are now looking right through the supply chain saying, what does Australia need to provide for into the future? We have some massive natural advantages. The fact that we have a vaccine manufacturer like CSL is a massive natural advantage. The fact that we produce enough food for 75 million people and we're 25 million people is a massive natural advantage. But the fact that we used to have 4 refineries, now we're down to 2, means that we are vulnerable, for example, around fuel security, which is hence why we announced in the budget some new initiatives to support those refineries continue to operate sustainably in Australia. So across the board, you will see countries like Australia partner with like-minded countries to secure supply chains in the event of crisis. So thank you, Melinda, and thank you, Diane and CEDA, for the invitation to be here. It's been a very tumultuous period over the last 18 months or so. I thought it was hard enough with drought and then bushfires and then to throw in a pandemic after that. I'm wondering what's next. But it was also a time when the country came together. I think Australia has performed incredibly well. There are still massive challenges, as we all know, including rolling out the vaccine, hotel quarantine, ensuring that the economic recovery continues. We've got incredibly accommodative monetary policy. We've got fiscal policy, which has seen more than $240 billion being accumulated on household balance sheet and business balance sheets. That was not there this time last year. That's money that will continue to be spent across the economy. We've got a big microeconomic reform challenge ahead of us, and happy to speak to that in the Q&A. But I tell you what, when you look around the rest of the world, including where I started in a country like Ireland, and you compare what's happened there to what's happened here in Australia, there's no place you would rather be. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Treasurer. Just before I make a comment, I'm just going to let people know, I'm going to refresh my pigeonhole here, and if you've got questions, but we do have some mics in the room. Introduce yourself in the normal way and fire away. But just while we're waiting for some questions. I mean, how good does it get being on stage with the Treasurer twice in a week? It's like all my dreams have come true. But in all seriousness, firstly, thank you for your support for CEDA. Over the past 18 months, you've obviously done quite a few live streams for us. I know our members really appreciate it. There's nothing like hearing directly from you. But this is the first opportunity I've had to sort of speak to you personally. And it would be remiss of me not to actually say to you on behalf of my team and our members, and I think for everyone in the room, that we just want to acknowledge the role that you and your department have played and the government have played in actually putting the economy in the position that it is. And I think there is a really strong consensus that we are in good shape. Over the next 2 days, we're going to have some hopefully challenging conversations. Those conversations are in the spirit of how good we might be. Sometimes they play across, maybe seem a bit negative or critical, but I think taking the mood from the room tonight, there is a real sense of how do we use what we've achieved to actually build an even brighter future. So it's great that you can be here to help us kick off. If I can't see any hands, there's a hand. Oh, wait. I do have a question for you. Let's start at the back first. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Nadia Moffat and I'm from Adelaide. Thank you for everything that you have done. I really appreciate it. I'm inspired by everything, but I think that there can be some tweaks and opportunities to do more that don't necessarily cost money. So employment and social policy has been a big part of what you guys are doing. People with a disability actually have the highest rate of unemployment in the country, and Scott Morrison's government actually has a target of 7% for the Australian Public Service, which is unbelievably insightful because it will change the culture into the future. I'd like to see that go onto the agenda of National Cabinet so that the states that don't currently adopt that target will be encouraged to do so. Because we all know that if you're not achieving the best you can, it's because your culture's not quite right.
Well, thank you very much. I think you make a very important point about creating opportunities, breaking down barriers for people with a disability to enter into employment. And not only are they going to be great contributors to that economic success of the particular business, or if it's a not-for-profit, for what it does, but it's also going to contribute to that person's well-being, and that's vitally important. After the budget, I joined Dylan Alcott, who's an incredible Australian. As you would all know, he's a Grand Slam tennis champion, to announce support for some programs that he has developed to skill up people with a disability and get them job ready. And so we're looking and working with ambassadors like him on particular programs. And so he's developed a broader skills agenda. He uses sport as a medium to get people with a disability more active, and it's also about skilling up for the workforce as well.
I think it would be remiss of me, I mean, it's great that governments are aspiring to that, but there's also a real challenge within our business community as well, for people with disabilities and older workers as well, and making sure we address some of the biases that exist in hiring there. Julie.
Treasurer, Julie Hunter from Commonwealth Bank. I'm just wondering to what extent the opportunity exists to really sell the vision of new clean energy jobs, particularly in areas like green hydrogen, to overcome some of the resistance that we otherwise see in the community, including the political community, to the clean energy transition.
Yeah, well, I used to be the energy minister, although I'm trying to forget that period. I could take off my jacket and show you the scars. It's, of all the policy areas I've worked in, and no doubt people in this room have worked in as well, it's been the most vexed because it's become subject to sort of cultural battles as opposed to what we've always focused on. We've talked about economics, engineering, and obviously the environment, science. And you're simultaneously trying to solve for three things: lower emissions, lower prices, and ultimately a stable energy grid in a period of rapid change. Australia, if you unpack our situation with respect to energy, we are different to a lot of countries. I mean, yes, the Poles and others rely on coal, or the Russians producing gas, but we are very much a resource powerhouse. We're a continent, and so we're a large, the national energy market doesn't even include Western Australia. That's how big we are, right? And so our situation's quite different to other countries. That being said, we have reduced our emissions by 20% on 2005 levels. That's ahead of the US, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, and other comparable countries. Our rollout of renewables on a per capita basis is 8 times as fast as major economies like the United States. We have the highest rooftop on a solar on a per capita basis at 1 in 4 households. So we have done a lot of things and we continue to do a lot of things. You're right about hydrogen as being a new area, and what we're seeking to do is partner with other countries like Germany and Japan to develop technology partnerships with them. So they've been put in place, and the Prime Minister had some very productive discussions as part of his visit to the G7. So increasingly those international partnerships are going to be very important. But in the meantime, our focus as the economy, as the energy system transitions, is to try to keep it stable. And there was some criticism of our decision around supporting a new gas-fired power station in New South Wales with the closure of Liddell. But having been the Energy Minister when we saw the closure of Hazelwood and the massive spike in the wholesale price, meant that we, and I'm part of the government as the Treasurer, we didn't want to leave it to chance when Liddell closes in New South Wales to see a repeat of that experience in Victoria. And Victoria went from being a net exporter of energy to being a net importer and relying on New South Wales and others. So there's going to be a period of transition in our energy system which requires significant market intervention because it's not really an efficient working market. It's just not, and it's struggled for some time now. So it does require those levels of government interventions, but in terms of the overall transition, it's happening. It can't be stopped. More renewables are coming in. The key is, as more renewables come in, which are largely intermittent in nature, how are you going to provide the backup? And that's where Snowy 2.0 comes in. That's where a second interconnector from Tasmania into Victoria is going to come in. That's where AEMO's transmission projects, which we're supporting, all come in to play. Technology, not taxes, is not a slogan. It's actually the truth. If we invest in the technology, we will be able to make a smoother transition than we've seen today. And if you make a smooth transition, then you will take people with you. The reason why we have 1 in 4 households with rooftop solar is because we've subsidised the hell out of it, right? People have made an economic decision. They haven't done it because they feel good, right? Some people have. But by and large, the majority of people have done it because it's economically sensible for them to do it. So what we have to do is make the economics of this transition work for people. And it works for people when you have sustainable power. And that's why gas is going to be a key transition fuel for us going forward.
Treasurer, can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
And it really isn't meant to be, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, it's not meant to be a political question, but when you listen to the story about the progress that we're making in reducing emissions, the things that we're doing, do you think that if we actually just made the commitment to net zero 2050, that actually the other pieces of the puzzle would attract less criticism because they would be seen as part of an overall commitment that recognised that we can actually get there and that we don't necessarily need the whole path, and that you would actually bring more people with you in some of the measures and the interventions and things like that because they'd be seen in that context rather than a context that sort of implies we can't get there?
Look, the last election was really instructive in this respect, Melinda. We went to the election saying we will reduce emissions by 26 to 28% by 2030 by 2030 on 2005 levels. The other side of politics went to the election saying 45% target, much higher target. But when they came to, in the glare of an election, came to being asked what is the cost of that, they couldn't give the answer. And you never underestimate the public. And the public, when they hear you say net zero by 2050, well, the next question is how, what, where, when, how does it all add up? So unless you can actually spell out the cost or the program to get there, then out there in the broader public, they will be inherently sceptical. They don't disagree with the notion of reducing emissions over time and being a good global citizen and being part of that challenge. I think people have bought into that, and understandably so. It's an important objective, but the public actually want to know, what does it mean for them? A lot of these countries have committed to net zero 2050 have not put any plan together as to how they're going to get there. And that is not something that our government, has done, because when we make a commitment, we try to back it up with a plan.
Alison.
Treasurer, I'm going to go to a different topic. I am still celebrating the budget, and particularly, as you know, we're very thrilled with the childcare measures. I've got a few more ideas for you, and we're going to talk to you about paid parental leave soon. We've also moved on from the budget, and we have to say we're incredibly grateful to you for the visa changes this week, and allowing us to recruit auditors and accountants from overseas is a great source of excitement to me in the room, even if I'm the only one in the room tonight who feels like that. But so thank you very much for that. But I did want to change the topic slightly. Before you came tonight, Diane did one of her famous surveys, and I think there was almost unanimous support in the room tonight for business community feeling they have a role to play in helping with vaccine rollout. But absent clear supply, we're a little struggling with how we can help you. So I guess I'm really interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, more supply is coming on, and obviously there are some things we can control and there are some things we can't control. AstraZeneca, made under licence here by CSL, has had a few roadblocks. Everyone's aware of that, and we have been very quick to take the advice of ATAGI and the health experts, as you would expect us to do. You can't control that. The Pfizer vaccine, we've got about 3.4 million coming in by the end of July. There's a bit over 2 million available today. Clearly you've got a much greater cohort now taking the Pfizer vaccine. I suppose where business can help, Alison, is overcome vaccine hesitancy, because that is occurring in every country, somewhat differing degrees, but it's occurring everywhere. And obviously we want to get to a situation where as many people are vaccinated as possible. So if business can work to help in that task in various ways, then that would be good. I mean, I noticed some, I turned on Channel 9 the other day and they had their own in-house ad using all their stars, encouraging people to get the jab. Now, we didn't ask them to do that as far as I'm aware, but if, other businesses in other ways could reach their employees or their stakeholders, or whoever they may be, and just get the message to people to have the vaccine. I noticed in the Philippines they're arresting anyone who doesn't take the vaccine. Well, news alert.
Again, not CEDA policy.
News alert for Kieran Gilbert. We're not doing that here in Australia, but anyway.
We were talking before about, free beer with your jab or something like that.
Well, I'm sure there will be incentives along the way, and we're just working out how and what. But there's some talk about vaccine passports, and that has been discussed. And people will want to move internationally and obviously domestically as freely as possible. And so when the vaccine rollout gains pace, there might be opportunities there for that.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Oh, happy to take it.
Dr. Irina Zabortseva, Treasurer, thank you very much for addressing very important steps that have been done to ensure stability and economic growth of our economy. In line with this, when it comes to international competitiveness, Australia is ranked, some of the Australians' rankings are not as positive as the steps that you've highlighted. This includes long-term strategic economic vision, where Australia is ranked lower than 90th position in the world. Technological developments and cybersecurity. You've already spoke what is done to address technological developments. What about other issues? What is done to address them?
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, again, it sort of comes down to this notion of productivity. So productivity is a combination of capital deepening, so investment, and we're trying to encourage that. And I met with a whole lot of CFOs today, and my message to them was, start investing in your future now. As Phil Lowe was saying the other day, he gets a sense that some businesses are hesitant. And so I think investment is critical, and now's a good time to do that. The other part of the productivity equation is multi-factor productivity, which they call the magic sauce, is how does labour and capital interact, right? And Australia hasn't been as good as maybe we would have hoped in that aspect of the productivity equation. The mining sector has been better than the non-mining sector, and that is something that we need to focus on. The digital adoption and adaptation is critical. I mean, the economists in the room will tell you there are different reasons why there is a decline globally in productivity. Part of it is maybe how do you measure it? Part of it is more of a globalised economy. Part of it is because of a more services-orientated economy, as opposed to manufacturing where you're producing a certain amount of widgets. And so in services more labour intensive. So the economy's transforming and it's posing challenges. How do you compare and measure productivity? But our 30-year average has been 1.5%, and we're not there, right? We're not 1.5%. And if you look back at the last few decades, 80% of our economic growth has been driven by productivity. The other two drivers of productivity are participation and population. Well, I can tell you what you're going to see in the IGR is our population's going to be smaller than we initially thought because of the effects, and that's a permanent thing, because of what's happened with COVID. We just don't make it up. And, COVID's been population growth is the lowest level in 100 years. Net overseas migration is negative, and it's going to take some time to pick that up. Participation has been on the rise in Australia, particularly women's workforce participation, which rose in May and is around record highs. But as you get an ageing population, you start to plateau and even come down with workforce participation. So we're going to have challenges on population, we're going to have participation, and so our energies need to be productivity. And this is, I see my role as treasurer of trying to deal with the macroeconomic settings, which the unemployment numbers and the economic growth, and deal with all that. And I haven't mentioned it yet, but I'm very pleased that S&P kept our AAA credit rating. That was very important. But my other job is to try to push through what you were alluding to, which is productivity enhancing microeconomic reforms. And tonight, through the Parliament, I think it was tonight or last night, we passed what is called the automatic mutual recognition for occupational licensing laws changes, which means that more than 150,000 people will move around Australia every year and go into state and not have to get a new licence or pay a new fee or join a new body. This is going to produce a couple of $1 billion extra to our bottom, to economic growth. But it's a microeconomic reform. It's a deregulation. What we did on superannuation through the Parliament last week, which was pretty hard to get through, but what we got through was the most significant changes in 30 years since compulsory super came in 92, and they will be productivity enhancing reforms in to a superannuation pool of $3 trillion growing to $5 trillion by 2035. It's remarkable. What we've done on insolvency, the biggest changes in 30 years on insolvency. As I mentioned, getting rid of a whole tax bracket. Even what we did on digital platforms with Facebook and Google, which matters a lot to those sectors, was world-leading microeconomic reform. Great work by the ACCC that gave us that piece of work that we could then turn into a legislative framework. So whether it's insolvency, tax, super, automatic mutual recognition, what we've done on foreign investment, what we did on digital platforms, there are some significant microeconomic reforms that are happening as we speak. And I suppose if I can leave you with one thing tonight, we always have to say, what's next, you know? When we leave out of here, what's next? No one rests on their laurels. But don't for a minute forget how well we have done as a nation. That's not a pat on the back for us as the government, that's a pat on the back for Australians. The fact that our economy today is bigger than it was going into the pandemic, the fact that there are more people in work today than going into the pandemic, the fact that the size of the contraction globally was 30 times what happened during the GFC, and the fact that, you know, minus a few New South Welshmen, you're all here tonight, you know, sitting in an open room in the middle of a pandemic. Other countries are not, or not in the same way as we are. And so there's a long way to go. We're not out of this yet. We have spent a significant amount of money, money that will, you know, that I don't think was spent badly. I think that was invested wisely. And the net result is that we have prevented a generation of Australians going into long-term unemployment. Because once that connection between employer and employee would have been broken, but for JobKeeper, you would have seen businesses take on a smaller number of people on the other side of this pandemic, let alone if they would have survived. And I just think that's been a remarkable achievement for our country today. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Treasurer. Great work on the mutual recognition. I think it was picked up in the New South Wales Productivity Commission recommendations, as well as the Shifting the Dial report, which was 4 years ago. I'm just putting a plug in for the next 5-year productivity review for the Productivity Commission next year, and then we can get you back on stage to talk about that. Well, we'll see what happens with next elections, not making any projections there. Predictions or projections or anything else. Can I invite to the stage Julie Hunter, who's the Managing Director. Julie says Managing Director of Banks and Government at the...
Banks, Government and Higher Education.
Banks, Government and Higher Education at the Commonwealth Bank. But that should maybe not fit on your business
quite
card.
a mouthful, I know. Thanks, Melinda. And look, thank you, Treasurer, very much for your leadership and also for your reflections on the past year and also your comments on Australia's transition out of the pandemic and to recovery. And that transition to recovery is something that we at the Commonwealth Bank are extremely committed to, as we know are everybody in this room. As you spoke, I found myself reflecting on the legacy of Sir Douglas Copland, who was the founder of CEDA, who created the organisation 61 years ago with the purpose of charting a brighter economic future for Australia. At that time, there were post-war constraints on the domestic economy, and as they lifted, Sir Douglas was concerned about the direction of the country's economic future. He saw CEDA, a forum for sharing cutting-edge thinking, informed discussion and rigorous research, as an opportunity to actually rise and meet the challenges that the circumstances presented. And I'm sure that he would have been delighted with this evening's panel discussion. And also, Treasurer, I'm sure that Sir Douglas would have listened to your comments here with great interest. I think in an interesting parallel to that post-wartime period, Australia has managed its way through a crisis and now the ensuing recovery, some minor setbacks aside, as you've noted, remarkably well. This has been largely due to a number of key policy responses at critical points, and I think we do have to call out JobKeeper as being one very key example of that, which importantly helped provide certainty to the Australian public in a very uncertain period. In addition to this, what I think has been notable is that individuals and organisations, both within the public and the private sectors, have really come together in this time to solve problems and deliver more than what was expected in order to support their fellow Australians. And I do believe that the solidarity of the Australian community has been genuinely notable in global terms. So the challenges that stand before us all today are still significant. However, as the panel before noted, and Treasurer, as you've also noted, they afford us the opportunity to build back better. Over the next 2 days, in order for us to meet that Build Back Better challenge, CEDA is bringing together leaders from across Australia and the world from both the public and the private sectors. And I'm particularly thrilled to be hosting a discussion tomorrow with world-renowned economist Mariana Mazzucato, and she's going to be talking about her new book, The Mission Economy, which picks up, for those of you who know Professor Mazzucato's work, she picks up on Ming's point earlier as an early advocate for a different way of thinking about GDP, and importantly thinking about how the public and the private sector can work together more effectively, sharing risks and returns in order to truly strive for achieving those moonshot outcomes. I'm certain this is all going to lead to fresh insights and opportunities to collaborate, which will help Australia recover from this previous period even better. So, Treasurer, thank you once again for your comments, for your leadership, and to our audience, please join me in a vote of thanks.